Topic 7, Macroeconomic Policy Part 1. So we've got 3 macroeconomic policy topics over the next 3 weeks. If you were to ask me at a very high level what the major macroeconomic concerns or goals of economic policymakers and economists are, and I'm thinking about the government and the Reserve Bank mainly here, I would create this list here. So first of all, maximising long-run economic growth. That is obviously linked with raising average living standards. Now, the way economists measure economic growth is growth in real GDP. And we know that there isn't a perfect correlation between growth in real GDP and increases in average living standards. Of course not, because growth in real GDP doesn't include factors such as crime levels, such as income inequality, such as environmental conditions, and a whole range of other factors that affect average living standards. But we do use real GDP or growth in real GDP in economics as a guide to, or as a measure of economic growth, and also as a guide to improvements or growth in average living standards, really because of a lack of any alternative. Over the last 20 years, there have been a number of organisations that have tried to create indexes of living standards, and they've incorporated some of the measures that I have just listed. So not only in these indexes, not only was real GDP included, or the growth in real GDP over time, but also changes in crime, changes in crowding in the cities, changes in environmental conditions, and a whole range of other factors that may affect living standards. The problem with that is, while you may be able to do that for 1 or 2 countries, trying to do it for all countries in the world is going to be very, very difficult, very time intensive, and the data may just not be there to create effective indexes of the standard of living and how that standard changes over a long period of time in a whole range of different countries. So we, by necessity, I guess, we do fall back to real GDP as a metric of, or the most easiest to acquire metric of long-term economic growth. And of course, then we kind of have to wave our hands in the air and say, well, it's not a perfect indication of how living standards are changing over time, but it'll indicate to some degree how living standards are changing over time. The next one, we've already dealt with this, minimising short-run economic fluctuations. That is just making sure that the trough in the business cycle is as low as it possibly can be using monetary and fiscal policy, and that the peaks of the business cycle are as. Number 2 is all about smoothing out the business cycle. We're going to deal with maximising long-run economic growth in a sense in topic 9. We'll be dealing with minimising short-run economic fluctuations in topics 7 and 8. And then in topic 8, we'll also be dealing with sustainable government debt levels. So the idea there is, around the world, many countries have built up incredibly high levels of government debt. Now, there are arguments out there that that doesn't matter. Some people are saying the government can just continue spending at will, and the level of government debt isn't a concern. This is one of the beliefs of a theory called modern monetary theory, and we'll investigate that to some extent. Other economists, majority of economists, believe that accumulating high government debt levels is very dangerous indeed. It can lead to potentially debt crises and also impose constraints on fiscal policy in that particular country in the future, as well as imposing constraints on future generations. So, for example, in the US, their level of federal government debt alone is around about $30 trillion. That's about 120, 125% of their GDP. And it's that $30 trillion worth of government debt that is just being handed down generation to generation to generation. in the end, someone is going to pay for that debt. Someone is going to have to pay that debt in a sense. And there's a lot of different ways that that debt can be paid. And I'll talk more about that in the next topic, and I'll help you understand if a government has a very high level of debt, the different ways in which it can be paid. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, well, you just run a government budget surplus. The government, over a long period of time, spends less than it generates in taxation revenue, runs a surplus, and that surplus can be used to pay down debt. But that's true. That's one way government debt levels can be paid in a sense. But there's other things that can be done and other ways of paying for that debt in a sense. You're probably not aware of those, so we'll leave that for the next topic. And then the final one is income inequality. And I just noticed before that there's a bit of a glitch here in my explanation in brackets. Research suggests that lower income inequality is associated with higher average economic growth. Now, in the literature, once again, there's a little bit of uncertainty about this, but most people seem to suggest that countries that have a lower degree of income inequality tend to achieve a slightly higher long-run average rate of economic growth. Okay, and we'll be dealing with income inequality towards the end of the course as well. So what we're going to do now in this topic is really focus on minimizing these short-run economic fluctuations. So we're going to be looking at monetary policy in Australia, monetary policy in Singapore, and there'll be a lot to read about monetary policy in this topic. But one of the interesting things about this topic, monetary policy in Australia, is once you've done this topic, you'll be one of the few Australians, or if you're from overseas, one of the few international students, I guess, that fully understand how monetary policy operates in Australia. Most Australians have no idea, and I know this because I talk to them about it all the time, and people very often complain about banks raising interest rates or the central bank raising interest rates unnecessarily. And I hear this all the time, and most people just have a misunderstanding of what this topic is all about. So let's start with an exploration of monetary policy, which is the main topic of this week, week 7. So just a reminder, we are doing minimizing short-run economic growth, economic fluctuations using monetary policy. Topic 7 will be about fiscal policy. And a big topic there will be sustainable government debt levels. And we'll be looking at countries such as Japan. They've got an extraordinarily high level of government debt as a ratio of GDP. We'll be looking at the US and comparing that to Australia. Then later on in the course, we'll be dealing with maximising long-run economic growth, or just the economic growth process and what is required to achieve economic growth, and look at a range of countries around the world. That'll be topic 9. And then income inequality comes towards the end of the course. Just for now, we are looking at inflation targeting. So I've got a reading for you to read about this, but just a little bit of background about inflation targeting in Australia. So what we've got in this graph is inflation over a very long period of time. It's hard to tell exactly when this graph commences, but if that's 1964 there, it probably commences in the sort of late 50s. So a very long time series of data, probably 60 years. And prior to the early 1970s, inflation was under control in Australia. It bounced around quite a bit, but it was sort of mainly between 0 and about 4.5%. Then in the early 1970s, we had a big oil price shock, a global oil price shock. Now, the Australian economy and the global economy was much more dependent upon oil back then in the early 1970s. What I mean by that is, think about what the Australian economy produces today. compared to the early 1970s, there is a lot more production of goods and services that do not require oil or oil-related products. I'm not saying they don't require any oil, but they're less oil intensive. So for example, today the whole services sector is far larger than it was back in the early 1970s. Services, to my knowledge, aren't oil intensive. Manufacturing is, as an example. And manufacturing is a much smaller part of the Australian economy, it's a much smaller percentage of GDP today than it was back in the early 1970s. So one thing that we can take from that is when we get an oil price shock today, it's going to have less of an impact on inflation, because we know high oil prices increase the production costs of firms, and that is then passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices of final goods and services. So higher oil prices do create inflation. But one thing we can take away from that is less inflation will be created today than would be the case back in the early 1970s, because the Australian economy is less oil intensive. That doesn't mean, I'm certainly not saying that higher oil prices will not create inflation today. Of course they will. 2022 is a perfect example of that. But what I am saying is that for a given increase in oil prices, we will get a smaller impact on inflation today than we would have back in the early 1970s. So in the early 1970s, oil prices went through the roof and we experienced a period of very strong inflation. Inflation sort of came back down to about 8%, jumped up to about 10% in the late 1970s. But then we had another oil price shock in the early 1980s, and you can sort of see that second increase there from about 1980, 81, I think it was, through to about 84. There was another spike in inflation. Inflation sort of dropped there that would have been the 82, 83 recession, where the inflation rate dropped, but we came out of that recession quite strongly and inflation just jumped right back up. In the late 1980s, the Australian Central Bank and government began to realise that the inflation that we were experiencing from the early 1970s through to the mid-1980s, that's a period of 15, 16, 17 years of 8 to 10% inflation on average. Just think about that. In 2021, we're experiencing 2022, we experienced inflation of sort of 6 to 7% in Australia, and people are really feeling that. But that inflation was only in place for sort of 12 months. Imagine 15 years of 8 to 10% inflation. Imagine what that did. One of the big problems is your money wage is always struggling to catch up to the inflation. Prices rise, your wages respond with a lag. So that's just one of the problems associated with this high inflation. So in the late 1980s, the central bank decided that this high inflation was just too costly to the Australian economy. And you should have an idea of the costs of inflation by now. And so they increased mortgage interest rates through an increase in the cash rate. Mortgage interest rates in Australia in the late 1980s exceeded 18%. Now, at the time, the inflation rate was double digit. So that implies a real interest rate of probably about 8%. But that 8% real interest rate on mortgages back in the late 1980s pushed the Australian economy into the 1990-91 recession. And prior to the COVID recession in 2021, the 1990-91 recession was the last recession we had in Australia. So the Reserve Bank raised mortgage interest rates up to 18%. Imagine that though. Just take a minute to think. about that. You've borrowed money and the mortgage interest rates might have been sort of 8-9% at the time, but the real interest rate would have been much lower. And then the next thing you know, they're up to 18%. And I still remember that time in Australia watching TV and people being forced to sell their house. People, young couples in particular, in the early 1990s, being forced, had just got married. I remember these stories so clearly. They'd just got married, moved into their own home, bought their own home. A year later, 18 months later, when mortgage rates hit 18%, they had to sell their house, move back in with their parents. And this is 12, 18 months after they had got married. So this is what the central bank did at the time, and they did it to get rid of this inflation. And they knew it was going to create that sort of pain for so many Australians. And over this period, in the early 1990s, that recession, around about 600,000 Australians lost their job. So the Reserve Bank was prepared for Australia to go through all of that pain to tackle this inflation. Now, it's no good just pushing an economy into recession and have the inflation rate drop like it did to about 2.5%, and then take the foot off the brake, lower interest rates, and watch the inflation rate just rise back up again. So what they did, they raised interest rates to 18%, watched the inflation rate during that recession of 1990-91 fall to 2.5%. Well, it looks closer to 2 there at the very low point, so 2 to 2.5%. And then in 1990-91, the Reserve Bank, for the first time ever, introduced an inflation target into Australia. And we've already learned that that inflation target really does control inflationary expectations. It limits your wage demands, and if you are a firm, it limits the rate at which you are likely to increase the prices of the goods and services that you produce and sell. So those inflation targets, or that inflation target that we introduced in Australia of 2 to 3%, was successful from 1991 all the way through to 2022. And in 2022, of course, that being very, very recent, we did experience an inflationary outbreak. But as we all know now, that inflation has come mainly from the cost side of the economy, from the supply side of the economy. And just think about that inflation, or the majority of that inflation, being caused by a leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve. Now, when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, generally two things that can create that. Number one, an increase in input prices that the firms have to pay, an increase in electricity prices, wages, or the prices of intermediate goods that companies use in the production of their final goods and services. If those input prices rise, those higher costs will be passed on to customers in the form of higher prices of final goods and services. There's your supply side inflation. The other possibility is just limitations on the ability of companies to produce. And we had a perfect example of this, an unfortunate but perfect example of this in 2020-21, when COVID-19 forced many businesses to close. There were lockdowns across the country and businesses were simply unable to go about producing. And so that led to shortages of goods and services right across the Australian economy. And whenever you have a shortage of a particular good or service, there is going to be upward pressure on the price level. And so we did get this inflation in 2021-22, mainly as a result of these supply side factors from the production side of the economy. That is higher input prices and physical constraints, or just let's say constraints on the ability of firms to actually produce goods and services, e.g. shutdowns. And so that's why this inflation target, which was successful right up until 2021, was really unable to cope with the inflation that hit the Australian economy and the global economy in 2022. Because an inflation target, while good at sort of controlling the sort of inflation target, while it's very good at sort of controlling wages growth and the rate at which companies push up prices in normal economic conditions, when the economy is hit by a big supply side shock, like it was in 2021-22, it's very difficult for an inflation targeting regime, I should say, to combat the sort of supply side pressures that were felt in the Australian and global economies in 21-22. So inflation targeting, while it is very good in sort of normal economic conditions, when supply side pressures are at most moderate, so when there is sort of no extraordinary circumstances, I guess, in the economy, inflation targeting can be quite good in that situation. But when the economy is hit with massive supply side shocks, then inflation targeting is really a little bit out of its depth. And we saw that because the actual inflation rate in Australia, 6 to 7%, well exceeded the upper bound of that 3% inflation targeting. And of course, that's when the central bank then needs to use monetary policy to combat that inflationary pressure. So the way I like to think about inflation targeting, that is the announcement of a 2 to 3% target, which controls inflationary expectations, is that it does a very, very good job when economic conditions are, let's say, moderate. So there's no strong supply side inflationary pressures, no strong demand side inflationary pressures. It's very easy then for inflation targeting to keep everything in check in terms of inflation, in terms of controlling our inflationary expectations. But as I've said, as 2021, 2022 proved, inflation targeting really struggled and failed to keep the inflation rate low when the economy was hit by massive supply side shocks to the macroeconomy. Those massive supply side shocks are higher input prices and supply chain blockages, and also just physical limitations on companies being able to produce. Okay, so that is an introduction to, or a reminder, I guess, of inflation targeting. Australia's inflation target of 2 to 3% is certainly a core part of monetary policy in this country. And by keeping inflationary expectations low over a long period of time, it's been very, very successful, even though it has struggled with the 2021, 2022 supply side shocks to the Australian economy.